Hello. In this video, I'm going to be covering lies about tolerances in lockpicking and lock design. I would like to do more videos on lock design in the future, which is why I'm calling this video 1. I think as lockpickers and the lockpicking community, we get a lot of experience and insight into what makes locks easier or harder to pick. And I think it's valuable. We can share that with lock manufacturers and consumers, and whether or not they choose to act on that information is another story, but we can share it and we can put it out there. And I personally think it's interesting. So I'd like to do some more videos on that in the future. I will give a warning in advance if you're to watch another video first if you want to learn to pick your first lock. If you've never picked a lock before, what I'm going to cover might be confusing and might not be helpful at all, and I'd recommend looking at another video first. However, if you've picked a few locks or you're interested in lock design, nothing I'm going to be covering is super advanced or complicated, and you're welcome to watch and watch and check it out with me. All right, so these are the two myths I want to cover. Let me first say I have told these myths multiple times, and I may continue to tell them in the future for practical reasons. The first one: if tolerances were perfect, single pin picking pin tumbler locks would not be possible. That's not true. And 2, because the holes drilled for the pin stacks are not perfectly aligned down the length of the housing, only one pin stack prevents rotation at any given time. That's also not true. These are things that I have said, and I'm not 100% sure I won't continue to say, because they do help explain lockpicking very quickly when you're teaching people for their very first time. It helps conceptually understand things. That being said, they're not true as they're written here or often said. So I want to go into a definition of lockpicking just because I think it's helpful. So according to lockquickie.com, lockpicking is the art of opening a lock through the analysis and manipulation of its components without using a key to open a lock. I think we could expand on that more. I also think that there's manipulation, like an area of manipulation that includes lockpicking, bypass, decoding, in general, this field of cracking. All of that can be included in a manipulation field in a way, where we expect we're not trying every possible combination. Otherwise, we could try every combination and thered be no speed advantage. When I think of manipulation, I'm thinking there is something being manipulated or adjusted so that we can open the lock faster than we could by using every possible combination, and obviously with more reliability than randomly guessing the correct combination. I think that's important because we're not talking about brute forcing locks. If you consider brute forcing a lock as lockpicking, then there really is no advantage to lockpicking. So going to the first myth here, if tolerances were perfect, single pin picking pin tumbler locks would not be possible. Conceptually, we can really disprove that just in our minds if we imagine a single pin lock with perfect tolerances. We know once we apply that turning force and we lift that first pin with our hook, when we get to the correct height, that lock's going to rotate open. So we know conceptually on a single pin lock, that's not true. Okay, so what if there are multiple pins and we have perfect tolerances? Even if there are multiple pins and perfect tolerances, we can apply rotational force such that they all bind. Even if the tolerances are so perfect we cannot identify directly if a pin is binding, once it is raised to the correct height, the remaining pins will be more difficult to raise, allowing decoding techniques. So if we had a lock with perfect tolerances, we'll say this is our perfect tolerances lock, and we apply a rotational force to it, heavy enough such that all the pins are binding. We go in with our hook, and actually I would not recommend a hook for this. If the tolerances were perfect, you might use something like a leashy tool. So you take your leashy tool, you slide it in there, you measure how hard it is to lift pin 1. You just get a feeling for, okay, how much force is required to lift pin 1. You go to pin 2, you lift it 1 level, you go back to pin 1, feel how hard it is to lift. If it's the same, go back to pin 2, lift it up another level, and repeat. Eventually, when pin 2 is at the correct height, it should continue to bind. It should hold the binding pin above the shear line. However, there will be more force applied to the remaining pins, And then when we go back to pin 1 with that leashy tool and feel it again, it should now be more difficult to lift or feel. Now that might take a few iterations, but it would definitely be more practical than trying every possible combination. It would be a viable technique of decoding the correct combination for the lock. And there would be other ways to manipulate the lock open still. That is definitely not the only fault of pin tumblers. There's also bumping, and I don't believe, even if you had perfect tolerances, when they're all binding, that still doesn't prevent impressioning. If every pin is binding, that doesn't stop impressioning, that doesn't stop picking. It doesn't change that. But we often say that if they were all binding, the lock would be unpickable, and that's just not true. It's just maybe easier to explain to somebody who's never picked a lock before. So that is a myth. If I missed something there, please let me know, though. Okay. The second myth: because the holes drilled for the pin stacks are not perfectly aligned down the length of the housing, only one pin stack prevents rotation at any given time. When I say down the length of the housing, I'm saying if we're looking at it like here, down this length right here. So oftentimes in videos, we'll show these being misaligned slightly like I've tried to do here. And we'll say like, okay, well, with clockwise rotation, we would say the binding order is 1, 3, 2, because 1 will be hit first, then 3, then 2. And that's not really how it works. It doesn't have to do with the alignment of the holes being drilled there. These can be in any shape. They can be in an S shape, and we could still have all the pins binding at the same time, or one pin binding at a given time. That arrangement of those, actually, you could have perfect tolerances and have this in an S shape. This is actually, I think it was Picking Principles who pointed this part out to me right here on the pin diameter. He was making sure he was reminding me to think about pin diameter as well when looking at the tolerances. I think it was when we were talking about disc locks, but I might be mixed up. But the pin diameter and shape at the shear line will affect where binding occurs. Here we would say it would be 3, 1, 2, because clearly 3 filling up the majority of the space, and that chamber for the pin stack is going to be pressed against first when we try to rotate it, and then 1, and then 2. But I think it's even more complicated than that. The plug will also not be perfect cylinder, and even if it was, there must be a gap for the shear line. That's just required. There must be some space. They're not a solid piece. They're two separate pieces. The plug can rest and bind in multiple positions in the lock. And this means, in theory, binding order may change based on where the turning tool is inserted, and not simply clockwise versus counterclockwise rotation. So here you can see I've got a plug in this housing, and it's super exaggerated here. But in one example, I can use the turning tool and put a little more downward force so that the front is binding here, but it gets pushed up that way so that the top is binding there. That's the direction it's pinching. And then the second example, it's binding towards the top and the bottom. Now, I don't believe that it's this simple. I'm just trying to do an exaggerated example. But do I think it makes a difference? Yes. When we're talking about thousandths of an inch or less than thousandths of an inch determining what a binding pin is, I think it does matter. So depending on how much space you have on here and how much you can rotate the plug, can affect that. And I think it's also important to consider that these holes that are drilled in the plug, because the plug is a cylinder, when you drill a hole through it, you're not going to get, when you start orienting that plug in different directions, the shape that's exerting pressure on the binding pin is not necessarily even two circles overlapping. That's sort of, so if I take this here and I may have a shape that almost looks like this, and that's very exaggerated. But that is what my plug may look like, and then it's overlapping with a hole something like this for the Bible or the shell. And that's very exaggerated, but what I mean is that the shapes are getting complex, and there's a lot of different orientations they could be in depending on how you put your turning tool in there and how you're exerting forces. And I do think that it's enough to shift it. How often and how much is going to depend on the lock. Some locks have very tight tolerances, some don't. I'm just saying that I think it exists and plays a role. So, lock design conclusions. 1. Pen tumblers are inherently flawed, designed even with perfect tolerances. So even if we have a perfect tolerance pen tumbler, we know we can open it. And we need to implement better designs, and they exist. And one example of that would be like Enclave, for example, of a pick-proof lock. I've heard people say there's no such thing as a pick-proof lock. That's not really true. You can design pick-proof locks that are, for all practical purposes, pick-proof. And beyond just practical, I mean, they are essentially pick-proof. I mean, technically, you can argue maybe there's ways that forces can be redirected through the lock, and some magical device could measure it. But no, there are designs that are pick-proof. We can make them. They exist. Enclave is a version of a pen tumbler. It's not perfect. There are certain manufacturing things that need to be accounted for with it, but it is an example of a pick-proof lock. And in the future, I'd like to do more videos on that. Current pen tumblers are not. Okay. If manufacturing a pen tumbler or some form of a challenge lock, ensuring uniform driver pen shape and diameter, as well as reducing the space between the plug and housing, will better disguise the binding pen. The position/alignment down the long axis of the plug is not inherently a problem or a design flaw. So, from a manufacturing perspective, if you're looking at quality control or something like that, you don't necessarily need to concentrate on, at least not for the picking stance, where that hole is along here. But you may want to concentrate on the uniformity of the pens, and also looking to see if you can reduce the gap between the plug and the housing to a reasonable extent. As you reduce that gap, you increase friction. In this example I've got right here, I have done a couple of things. I originally tried to glue a shim to the base of this right here so that it would push all the force upward and reduce the gap at the shear line here. When I tried to glue the shim to this, there was not enough space to even get the plug in. So I had to remove the shim, but then I saw just having the glue there, the residual glue that had dried, significantly tightened up the tolerances. And I could still add a shim on the opposite side and tighten the tolerances up even more. So this bitting is very straightforward. Just lift them all really high. 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. So very straightforward bitting. You can see at this point, maybe you can see, but it's very difficult for me to turn the key at this point. There's a lot of force to rotate the key. It would not be practical to sell to somebody, but it is interesting as a learning exercise. I can tell you that having done that, this lock is much harder to pick. Hard enough so that I cannot reliably do it in a quick manner on a video to show y'all. Sometimes I get it relatively quick, but not reliably. It has made it harder. This is something that you can practice with really quick on your own if you're a lockpicker. Just try taking some shims. You don't even need to mess up your lock with glue, but just start taking some shims and placing them at the bottom of the plug right there, and see how much you notice a difference. You can shorten the tolerances on your own, and then you can play with it and see, well, it didn't make a difference on this lock, or maybe on another lock you're just like, wow, this is 100 times harder. I believe it made it significantly harder to pick. It is still pickable. It is by no means like perfect or suddenly high security, but it is more difficult to pick. I think that's all I have to cover. I do have more stuff I want to talk about with locks in general and lock design in the future, but I think that's all I'm going to cover with this right now. If you have any comments or thoughts, or you play around with it yourself, please let me know. I really wanted to be able to say things like, reducing the tolerances here will have this direct effect in a picking experience. I think the geometries make it more complicated than that, especially with the idea that the plug being able to rotate with the holes being drilled in the cylinder. It's non-trivial as to what the direct effects will be to me. but maybe I'm overthinking it or not thinking clearly about it. I'm curious what y'all have to say if you have some insights there, as far as like, have you noticed when you use bottom of the keyway tension versus top of the keyway tensioning changes in binding order before, something like that. Yep, but that's all I've got. Thank you for watching. Here, I'll give this a real quick. I'll try to pick this real quick. We'll see if we get it or not. And you'll know if I got it or not because I'll just cut it at some point. Let's see if... It's really hard to hold this lock when you have to use this much force to turn it. It just tears up your hand. I do think this is maybe something you can do on your own, but maybe you want to use a vise or something to do it. See how it changes it for you. Maybe you don't think it changes it at all. I personally think that from a picking standpoint, it is much less enjoyable to pick because I have to put so much force. I really feel like the lock's digging into my hand right there. And as a user of the key, I would be really upset because it's extremely hard to turn the key. But it's definitely something you could practice with on your own if you're interested. Okay, yeah, I'm stopping there. This is no longer enjoyable to pick. But yeah, thank you for watching.